On this week's Thinking Caps, we have Jill Knesek, former FBI agent who's taken down all kinds of awesome big hacking schemes, which you'll learn about, but she's also a chief privacy and security expert. We also give you access to a new Forrester report titled The Capabilities Marketers Need to Build a Strategic Privacy Function. And it's great because Jill has great insight there, she has experience at companies, and she's going to guide you into the 3 must-haves when considering a privacy function inside your own company, whether you're just getting started in researching privacy or whether you have a well-established program. Check this episode out. Thank you for bringing in this very special guest, Jill Knesek. Jill Knesek is our Chief Security Officer here at CHEETAH Digital and has an amazing background. We won't have nearly enough time to go into the things I want to go into with her, but she really brings an awesome perspective. Richard, I know you have some great thoughts on why you nominated Jill to come on today.
Yeah, now we'll come on to kind of, background in security and privacy in a moment. But I wanted to get straight to it. On your resume, you have worked with a diverse array of organizations from the FBI to Mattel. But let's start off with the FBI. You were a special agent, working for the FBI on cybercrime. That's pretty cool, right?
That's cool.
It's a dream come true for me. I couldn't have been happier. I've always wanted to be an FBI agent, never knew how I would do it. Got into computers, got a degree in computers and started working in the IT field. And so just didn't even think about it. And then, one day I read the LA newspaper and they said they were looking for women and minorities as agents. They had a lack of that. And so I thought, what the heck, I'll throw my name in the hat. So I filled out an application, and about 11 months later, I got a call, said that after, tons and tons of process, that they'd accepted me into the new FBI special agent training class in Quantico, Virginia. So I was thrilled.
Now, which was harder, the interview process for CHEETAH Digital or the FBI?
I can assure you it was the FBI. I mean, CHEETAH Digital is pretty easy. I think the fact that I was an FBI agent, I intimidate everybody now. So they can't wait to get through the interview with me.
I'm going to be polite just so she doesn't look into my background. Anyway, no, that's really cool.
Yeah, it is. And whilst I'm sure there's lots of things you can't talk about from your time at the FBI, I know that you have been involved in a couple of big cybercrime cases and takedowns. So yeah, tell us what you can about that. Some of the famous cases you worked on, and kind of how that work transpires. What do you do?
So yeah, it was pretty exciting. I think the first thing is when I joined, it was 1998. The internet was really just starting to get its bearings, and hacking was very new. And the FBI only had about 5 regional offices that actually had any kind of cybercrime squads on it. So, LA obviously got a lot of the big ones. And when I came on, the Kevin Mitnick case was massive. It was already on 60 Minutes, was doing shows on it, 2020. So I came in and, I ended up on the cybercrime squad and never thought I'd work Kevin Mitnick. But my training agent was actually the case agent, and his background was as a CPA. So as he was trying to go through some of the evidence, he just didn't have a computer background. And so he started asking if I knew how to, did I know Unix? Did I know how to bring, backup tapes up? And I'm like, well, of course that's what I did for a living at, in my computer days. And so I ended up being the co-case agent on that one because there was no computer expertise on the team. The interesting thing about Kevin Mitnick, and by the way, he's got his own company now, makes a lot of money, a lot more money than I make, I'm sure.
Crime does pay, and sometimes in the cybercrime world.
Totally. You're absolutely right. Crime totally pays. But I think, the good thing is he's been reformed. I think he was young when he started into it, and it was a very new area. And I think what he's done is taken what he learned through those times, and he's actually helping people become more secure. He talks about social engineering. He implements a lot of security awareness training products and tools now. So I've not had a chance to actually work with him or talk to him since my FBI days, but Needless to say, yeah, crime does pay.
Can you give us the 30-second rundown on what the heart of that case was?
His main thing was to try to steal software that was running the Novell networks and then the Nokia phones. He was trying to hack into phones, mobile phones, which were, as you probably remember, big bricks. And so he was able to social engineer himself into some of these companies. Novell was a big, local area networking company way before we started really thinking about the internet. Was able to work through some of like the secretaries of the CTO and find out and get access to some of their infrastructure and their servers. Same with the Nokia phones, was able to get access to some of the operating system, the back end, so he could hack into them and eavesdrop on phone conversations and actually make free phone calls and things like that. It was a little bit just, I think, trying to figure out how things worked more than it was maybe, trying to commit crimes. But he ended up costing the company a lot of money and intellectual property because he was, he stole it, shared it, and then once it got out there, it kind of undervalued those two companies. So it was pretty significant at the time.
Another one of the famous cases I know that you worked on was Mafia Boy. Tell us a little bit about that one and what happened.
Mafia Boy was he got his hands on a tool. It was ended up being like a 15, 16-year-old kid out of Montreal, Canada. Got his hands on a tool that allowed him to basically, I guess, execute a denial of service attack against any site he wanted to at any given time and take them offline, which was, pretty big because our economy was just starting to work off the internet, and we were making sure that we had, the ability to be secure, but also to be able to run our economy and not let, a 15-year-old kid take out an entire company or set of companies in a matter of minutes. He was able to take down CNN, Buy.com, eBay. Buy.com was going through an IPO at the time, I think, and it killed their stock value. And then, we were sitting there. I sat in some of the chat, IRC chat channels back then was the cool thing to do. That's how you communicated. And he actually came into the room and said, "Hey, what do you want me to do? I can take down any site you want." And, we were undercover. Of course, he didn't know we were FBI. And he said, somebody said Dell. And so he said, okay. And he took down Dell.com, like right on the spot. And we're like, oh my gosh, this stuff is for real. So it's pretty scary.
Wow. And did he get a long sentence? Is he out now? What was the story with him?
He was, underage, juvenile. In the US, we would have done nothing. In Canada, they gave him, I think, a 2-year probation where he couldn't be around computer company or anybody that had computers. So he spent his 2 years, which were in high school, trying to be good and stay out of trouble. And eventually, once he got out, he got a job in the industry, and he's doing pretty well. He's got a few books on Amazon.com. If you go look on there, you can find him on there. But again, I guess crime paid okay for him too.
This kid should have went to jail by all accounts and skates through high school. I had a tough time in high school and I wasn't taking down companies like Dell. I mean, geez, overachiever making us look bad.
Yeah, I also wasn't smart. I also wasn't smart enough to take any of these companies down.
True.
So yeah,
I'm with you there.
All right, brilliant. Well, Joe, I know obviously you had a fascinating set of exposure to all things cybercrime coming to the FBI. You then switched gears and got into, becoming an important player in security and privacy, working for a diverse range of companies such as, BT and Mattel. So what was that kind of culture shock like going from the FBI to Mattel?
So I think it's a big difference because it's a totally different attitude. As you can imagine, working for a toy company, things are a lot lighter than working for a premier law enforcement agency that everybody's always, keeping an eye on. But I think the difference for me, the reason I really pushed that way was because I wanted to get in front of the crimes. I didn't want to wait until a crime occurred before we could help companies. I thought there's a lot that can be done just through proactive preventative measures, understanding how the criminal thought and spending the time working on these cases and seeing how what were they attacking? What were the exploits? What were the vulnerabilities? That I could get in front of some of the criminal activity by helping a company secure themselves. And I think a lot of other people in the security industry started seeing it the same thing. And we started understanding that, if you just did some really basic things in the beginning, you could probably knock out about 75 to 80% of the threats that were out there. And then after that, it just became making sure you clean up the little things that might be a target for a particular type of criminal or type of hacker. But it was totally different environment. It was, for me, I love doing it in private industries. I am very proud of my FBI career. I'm very proud of the people I work with, and I'm grateful that there's people still there doing the good work that we were trying to do when I was there. But today I feel it's just as important for people like myself to be out in private industry, talking to companies, helping decision making on where we invest time and energy, and what type of tools and technologies actually are the most effective in the world of hackers today. So it's an exciting time, to be in this space. It has been for the last, 10, 15 years, I would say. But, truly big difference between, even between BT and Mattel. I mean, BT is a large British company, very much like a government entity, 125,000 employees, I think, worldwide. And then Mattel is a little bit smaller US company, 15,000 employees with, a global footprint, but a different culture, a lot of fun. But believe it or not, we'll get into the privacy stuff. Richard, I know you got, there's stuff around that you're really passionate about. But can you imagine the privacy questions around children's data? Right. We talk about PII, but when you talk about children's data, wow, people really get, hypersensitive. And so I had a huge responsibility there that I took very seriously. And I still monitor, what's going on in the child privacy side of things, because adults, we have decisions to make, and we control some of our own fate. Let's say children are really at the mercy of manufacturers and their parents doing their homework. So I think a company like Mattel, it's an incredibly important place to learn about privacy, and that's where I really cut my teeth.
That's interesting. Last week we had a former EVP Leah Burnett, and one of his clients was Mattel, and he talked a lot about the COPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, that came through, a while ago, and how, today's kind of the same as that, but you have to get in front of it. But that's interesting. Here we are a week apart talking about the same kinds of things.
And if you think about, your job now as a chief security officer here at CHEETAH Digital, obviously CHEETAH as a marketing platform, collects data on behalf of the customers that use our platform in a whole wide range of different industries, everything from banks to CPG to publishers to travel companies. So lots and lots of customers around the world in many different jurisdictions using our technology to connect with consumers, collect data.
Billions of consumers.
That's a big task. How are you going about keeping our customers' data safe as it's processed on the platform?
Yeah, so I think some of the most important stuff is just getting the basics right. As I said, I think if you do some of the basic security hygiene, 75 to 80% of the threat is pretty much taken care of. It just becomes more of than fine tuning things. So one of the things I did when I came on board, obviously, as we divested from Experian, I had to build a team from scratch. We had really no infrastructure. So I was able to start from a zero platform to kind of build it from scratch and do exactly what I thought was the right things and spend the right investments on the right tools and technologies. So first and foremost is just the basics, getting your firewalls, getting your IDS, IPS in place, getting some of the endpoint protections for anti-malware, antivirus. But for me, the most important thing when I start talking about the privacy of the data is all about encryption. I think encrypting the data in transit and at rest is a huge security protocol that needs to be implemented wherever we can. And I take a lot of time making sure that end-to-end conversation, that the consumer is having with our clients who are using our particular platforms, that encryption is in place, that the data, even if it was to be compromised some way, would basically be gibberish. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we can do today. So encryption is top of my list. along with doing all the good basic security hygiene things that any good company should be doing.
Well, I can speak on behalf of our employees and customers to say that we're grateful to have you at the helm, keeping the data safe. But let's switch gears a little bit, because I know, privacy is also something which is under your purview. And, we talk a lot about privacy themes on this podcast because it relates directly to why we believe marketers need to be investing heavily in the kinds of things that we do. So on one hand, moving away from buying third-party data there, which can be risky in today's legislative environment around privacy, and moving to direct connections with consumers and first-party data, and building out zero-party data, even to the importance that the privacy disruption is having on ad tech, and actually why that means that brands need to try and build out their own direct-to-consumer logged-in customer base, and loyalty programs being a really important part of brands being able to do that and have that direct relationship to consumers to sort of abrogate themselves from some of this disruption around ad tech, which is impacting how people can personalize marketing to consumers. And obviously privacy legislation, I mean, it's not just privacy legislation, it's consumer attitudes to privacy as much as it is legislation, which is driving a lot of these changes. But certainly from a legislation perspective, love to get your kind of thoughts on what are some of the changes that are happening now around in privacy legislation around the world, and what do you think is going to be next on that agenda?
To start with, I think GDPR was kind of a landmark piece. It really laid some foundational groundwork for privacy and some of the implementation and compliance requirements that were going to be put into effect. And I think we've seen a lot of other countries try to jump on board and find ways to improve on that, or to implement something similar. We're certainly seeing that here in the U.S. on the California side with the CCPA. And I think there's different methods that they're going after. One is GDPR was more of just a standard compliance, like here's the things that you should be doing for good security and privacy practice. And the CCPA really starts focusing more about the management of data and how we're going to, what would be required of us as companies that take personal information. How are we able to use that data that's provided to us by individual consumers? And so for me, if I look at the broader terms of the privacy frameworks that's coming out there, what I see is kind of like three areas of focus. I think the first key area has been around awareness. So a lot of people never thought about privacy of data, of their own personal data. They don't really put value on personal information. So the first piece was that the company that's accepting the data should be very aware that they're taking personal information, that there is a higher standard that they should be putting around it with regards to security and encryption and things like that. But also on the consumer front, that they need to be aware that they're sharing personal information that could be very valuable to a hacker for the right reasons. And so to be careful on how you share that data, and just to be aware that personal information does have value. The second piece, I think, is around protection. And that kind of goes back to a mantra that I like to use is you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. So you must secure the data. You must provide protection around the data that you collect. So on the corporate front, companies that are collecting it, we have a requirement to implement strong security strategies and protection technologies to make sure that the data that we take in from clients and consumers around the globe is protected 24/7, end to end, no matter where it is in our process. But again, on the consumer front, there's an expectation that they're protecting it on their end as well, that they're doing business with consumers that are clients that they trust and vendors that they have confidence in, that they do a little homework on their own to make sure that, they're using, there's a little lock up at the corner when you go into the web browser, and that where you're sharing the data, that company is one that you've got some confidence that's going to manage it and handle it correctly. They have, privacy policies, et cetera, in place. And then the third piece is really around accountability, understanding that when you, as a company, accept personal information from a consumer, you have now taken over the accountability of that particular piece of information, and it's your job to protect it throughout the life of that data that resides in your environment. And then of course, there's accountability on the consumer as well to know that they, that data has value and to continue to manage that effectively in their own world. And I think those three pieces are really what's driving the privacy industry forward. And what we'll see is different legislation coming out, focusing on different points and areas of that space. But ultimately, I think those are going to be the three standard areas that we're going to want to always focus on, either as a company or as a consumer when we talk about our personal information.
Take a look at the US for a moment. We've obviously got CCPA in California. There's privacy moves in a number of other states like Vermont. When do you think we're likely to have some sort of federal privacy legislation for the US? Well,
I'm still waiting for federal regulations on cybersecurity, so probably not anytime soon. I say that a big tongue in cheek because there's a lot of stuff out there today that's improved, but we've not really done a good job as a country, let's say from a federal perspective, of implementing the type of regulations that will probably create a lot easier road for most of us, especially in the industry, because we don't work across state lines. We don't even really work across country borders anymore. Everything is just the internet, and it's kind of borderless, if you will. But I do think that I can tell you that a lot of politicians see this as a really big area, because it's not only affecting tons and tons of companies, but consumers care a lot about it. Their constituents care a lot about it. And I know that there's some of the senators and some of the representatives out there that have taken a real interest in privacy and done a lot of research, hired people into their staffs that focus on this. So I think there might be an opportunity in the next 2 to 5 years where they focus in on maybe getting some legislation that's going to encompass all the main points of these state regulations that are getting pushed out, and put something across the top that'll make it a little bit easier for both alignment and compliance, but also enforcement, which is, I think, an area that I know, coming from law enforcement, I preach a lot. It's really bad when you put in regulations that are unenforceable. And I think some of the things we're doing today aren't completely enforceable. And a good lawyer will probably be able to, kind of cut through some of the, some of the haze, because some of these things, it's really hard for a company to identify the location of a user. So what they're basically doing is whoever has the strongest legislation becomes the low bar for a company like us to align to. So it's very difficult right now.
No, wow, that's fascinating. Fascinating insight. And I think one thing is as we look at privacy and all things around it becoming a sort of political hot potato. Yeah. One is looking at the various different senators and others in the legislative bodies that are making privacy something that they're driving. That's an interesting topic on its own.
Yeah.
The flip side of it, which I definitely think we should do a future podcast on, is actually looking at how in election year the various different players
who's jumping on the privacy,
who's jumping on the privacy environment, and then also correlate that to actually how they're using data for their own campaigns.
Oh man, we could go for days on that. But yeah, it's interesting because Senator Gillibrand in New York just proposed legislation in that state for a federal watchdog. I'll call it a federal referee of sorts, to start thinking about from a compliance standpoint. So yeah, it's going to be interesting how many of it stick with it after the election or are using it as a card from a marketing perspective. But it's just, hey, Joe, I want to ask you, we're going to have Scott McNeely on our podcast next, and he famously went in front of Congress 20 some years ago and said, privacy's dead, get over it. What's the one question you'd want to ask Scott from your perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, now being inside of a brand platform, SaaS platform that protects, billions of records for different companies? What would be the one question you'd want to ask him and put him against the wall against?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. I think it goes back to enforcement. Are we, how do we create legislation that actually has teeth? Because it's one thing. We can jump through. A lot of companies are making a lot of money off of the privacy regulations. I'm not sure that they're actually. I'm sure that most of them are doing something good for the the industry. But at the same time, at the end of the day, our jobs should be to protect the data and do everything in our power to make sure that the personal information that's shared with us is protected to the highest standard that we would implement for our own personal information or that of our family and friends. So I think, from a perspective of privacy and legislation, what we need to make sure is that the things that we're implementing are enforceable. And I mean that in a way that's it's difficult because privacy is such it's still kind of fluid right now. But I think what we need to do is have very prescriptive requirements. We need to be able to say encryption is a must. You must encrypt it. If you're not encrypting it, then there's going to be some requirement for you, some enforcement against you to make sure that you don't make that mistake again.
Let's dig into that for a second. So if encryption is one of your suggested best practices, the first thing you even consider doing, is that difficult for companies to do internally, or in your experience, has that been a major hurdle for a company to tackle, or is that a pretty easy yeah, all right, encrypt our data, that's pretty easy, let's move on to the next one? Is it difficult or easy?
It depends. How's that?
Oh,
so if you're creating a new capability, collecting new data, it's easy to encrypt it from day one. That's the best way to do it. Going backwards and putting encryption across the top of an old platform or encrypting data that's been sitting there, there's overhead, there's bandwidth requirements, there's issues with the way that maybe the database was built in the first place. So I think it does depend. And I think if we start, one of the terms I use a lot, and we can't always do this, but I like to say from this day forward, because sometimes it's hard to look backwards and you have a lot of pushback from things. So I put a bunch of what I call compensating controls around the past. But from this day forward, anything we build will have encryption embedded into it. We'll have a security technology stack that is required from day one. And I think that's where we can start to make a difference. Data, as becomes old very quickly. So what I'm hoping is we do encrypt all of our data. That's one of the things that, that they got right even before we acquired the company, or I became a part of this company, was that the encryption was already in place. But at the same time, I think there is a requirement, for us to manage the data, the life of the data. If it's no longer of value and it's getting too old, we should get rid of it. And encrypt anything new coming in should just be a standard default. And it doesn't have to be difficult, but depending on how it was built, there can be overhead that is, difficult to get around.
So to summarize, what your recommendation would be if there's a client right now or a brand doing some research around privacy and they're looking at the reports, and by the way, we have a report from Forrester that's going to be available to everyone if you're viewing this, and I'll explain that quickly on how to get it. But if you're doing some research around privacy, you want to get compliant, you're not sure of what the regulations are going to be because none of us really know what they are, your recommendation sounds pretty solid, would be get your data in a platform that has encryption at the core. It's thinking security first, and encryption is a must-have, not a nice-to-have.
Correct. That's absolutely
Perfect.
correct. I mean, there's two phrases, and they're all cute and they're easy, easy to say, hard to implement, but that is security by design, privacy by design. And if all you do is create a culture in your organization that before they do anything new, they go, oh, shoot, is this secure? And does this comply with the privacy requirements that I know about or that I've been told I need to enforce? And if you start thinking from day one, that it's going to be much easier to build in security and keep the vulnerabilities out, and to make sure that the data is handled in a way that is compliant with all the privacy laws we know of today.
I would add to that to say that, marketers, that are, many of the folks that use our platform and the listeners to this podcast, now need to be very aware of what's going on with privacy. I mean, the laws are changing in many different legislations. It's one of those things that they can now have to keep up to date with. But I think probably more importantly than legislation is really, what do you believe as a marketer? What are your attitudes to privacy? Do you wear the white hat on this particular subject? And, we've said before in, prior podcast, that it's the same as someone moving into your street. You want to get to know them, you want to be a good neighbor. You don't do that by putting a tracking bug under the car and spy cameras through the window before you go around and introduce yourself. You don't. You go around with a bottle of wine and ask them about themselves, and that's part and parcel of the change that we're trying to lead. And I think that there are going to be brands that are going to win over this with their attitudes to privacy, and there are going to be brands that lose over this.
Yep.
And one of the biggest things that we will continue to push is consumers now have privacy has put the power in many ways in consumers' hands. So marketers need to think about what's the value exchange that I offer consumers in return for their data, in return for their engagement, in return for their loyalty. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do here at CHEETAH Digital.
Totally get it. And, you're right, because even IKEA, the last week of February, came out there, I think it was their VP of operations or someone from the marketing side came out with a 9-minute video that explained exactly how they were using customer data. Like, it was a transparent, automated, animated video that showed, hey, this is what we'll do with this data. Here's how you can clear your history on that. Here's how we use this other data in the app or in the store. And it's smart. I mean, you get ahead of it and it's transparent. It's the way you need to do business.
The other thing that you mentioned the Forrester report. This is a good report for folks to look at that are beginning their sort of research, or at least trying to level up maybe their company's approach to privacy. Forrester released this just a couple of weeks ago in February. And it's basically looking at all of the strategic capabilities that enterprises need for this new age of privacy we're in, it, segmenting all the services and the products that companies should be looking to implement. So we've made that available for all of the listeners of our podcast, and you can get it here.
I'm gonna tell you how you can get it right now, Richard. Do it. This is how you do it. If you're watching this podcast and it's late February, late winter 2020, you can text the word CAPS. CAPS, which you can also just text at any given time to get our podcast sent right to your phone.
Boom.
We will send you a link to watch all of our upcoming episodes right onto your mobile device. But if you want to get this report right now, which we'll have on the CheetahDigital.com website, we'll send it right to your phone. Just text the word CAPS. And I'll give you a couple of bullets here so you know what you're actually getting. As you mentioned, it's kind of a checklist. If you're looking into privacy, you're not sure what to do with your company, they give you some real three great key takeaways, like, what is the vulnerability from a technology standpoint, how to deal with, stifling innovation by adopting new technologies that haven't quite been vetted yet, and then the whole thing that's still up in the air of legislation, what's yet to come. But they talk about what Jill just mentioned, privacy by design. That was used in Europe over the last few years very successfully by companies because GDPR was before the regulations that are coming here in the United States. And right now with all the state laws and hopefully impending federal law, you're going to want to look at that. There's all kinds of great stuff in this report from Forrester. It's a quick read. It's only 10 pages. But if you are starting or even midway down what you feel like is your privacy research project, you need to get this report. There's tons of stuff in there. It actually calls out software and platforms that you can use for certain factions and functions in your marketing business and how to deal with this data. So again, text the word CAPS, CAPS, and we'll auto reply with that, or you can find it at CheetahDigital.com.
And lastly, thank you very much to Jill for sharing how interlinked the worlds of privacy and security are. So thank you, Jill.
Yep, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and appreciate it.
No worries. Great. And thank you for approving our background checks and giving us jobs. Till next time.
Happy to have
Thanks,
you.
too.
All right.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.